Aitor teaches courses in ethic relations, diversity management, in academic writing and film adaptation in modern languages and Basque Studies, Department of University of Deusto, Bilbao. He has published articles in Atlantis, Miscelánea, Revista Chilena de Literatura, and so on, and edited some volumes as well. Some of them are focused on minority and immigrant narrative and processes of cultural hybridization. He has been the director of the Erasmus Mundus MA program, Immigration and Social Cohesion, for 4 years, and head of the Modern Language and Basque Studies Department in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities in the University of Deusto. So he has a very, strong curriculum. Currently, he's preparing a book on trauma and ethnicity, and also involved in a project on diasporic identities. So I guess that I have said too much. So now it's his turn. He will present Native American echoes in the Agrarian vision of Wendell E. Berry. So thank you, Aitor, and it's your turn.
Thank you, Raul, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here at this inhospitable time. We're looking forward to the lunch already. Out of curiosity, how many of you have read Wendell Berry? Okay, so there are people who are familiar with his work. The kind of pairing that I am doing today may be a bit unusual, or some of you may find it striking, no? So intertwining the work of this writer, no? Who is considered an agrarian, and by agrarian we are to understand somebody who takes an interest in farming, the kind of relation that we humans have with the land, but I am connecting it to some of the topics, issues that come up in Native American fiction. Now, I went back to Wendell Berry, who began to write in the 1960s, because of the kind of environmental issues that are so relevant today. And somehow that was very much the root of the paper, because when I was rereading some of his essays, they were packed with not only explicit references to Native Americans, but many of the topics that he dealt with, the kind of concerns that he had, seemed very much alike. It's not exact overlapping, yes, between the views that we see in the Native American tradition and his works, but there are certainly convergences that I think are interesting to delve into, so that's what I'm going to do. The object of this contribution is to delve into this kind of unexpected connections, between particularly his early essays, and then I'm beginning with some Native American authors that became, quite popular in the 1980s, 1990s. So that's a kind of portrait of Wendell Berry. I think one first important element that he shares with Native American authors is that he is constantly worried with how we Western people have become increasingly, he speaks of it as a kind of disease, disconnected now from the earth, from the land, and how, we have been kind of deterritorialized now lately, and also the kind of impact that things like culture, the American frontier, the kind of impact that the movement of civilization, in the case of the U.S., westward had on rural communities. And basically he thinks of rural communities as a kind of endangered species, yes? Because, he turns it always, perhaps what most people would question in my presentation is that he's perceived, on the one hand, as somebody who is anti-capitalist, leftist, but on the other hand, he has this religious strand in all his writing, and of course we know how Western people went to America, and apart from empire, it was the Bible that they hit Indians with. So, but he finds ways now to read the Bible in a different light that somehow. So we will see that there are also similarities between the kind of spirituality or religiosity that he seems to be defending, and what we see in some native cultures. I think what he shares most clearly with Native American, both writers but peoples in general, is the fact that he sees his writings as an act of, I mean, he has been an activist in a more literal, he was arrested as when he was fighting against the coal mining in the Appalachian. He was also anti-war during the Vietnam War. So he's been, I mean, he's brought many of his ideas into action. And this we have seen happening among some Native American writers as well, that they write about the kind of concerns, related to the land primarily that bothered them, but often they turn into more active actions, against the. Now, one other problem with the project would be, well, this guy comes from Kentucky, and he's very much rooted there, and he thinks of himself as more of a Southern writer rather than a Western writer. But I think the fact that there is the concern with land occupation, colonization, urbanization, that is so central to his writing. And so it is for Native American nations, And of course, I mean, there were Indians all over the place in America when first Europeans arrived there. But it is true that when we think of the manifest destiny, myth and whatever, it is primarily the West and how the West was occupied and how that Euro-American expansion happened, that we, and I think to a great extent, although he's talking more generally and addressing the American culture in general, in his mind, it was what happened on the Western frontier that becomes more urgent as a kind of history that needs to be rewritten. He's, I'm basing mostly on 3 essays from this book that he published in 1977, The Unsettling of America. And when we think of the settling of America, again, it is the American frontier. In this seminal book, he has chapters devoted to different things. I'm concentrating on 3 of them, one about the occupation of space, another one about the use of energy and different types of energies and how they are often misused. And perhaps the one that would seem most relevant here is how he connects again the body, the human body, to the earth. Now, the book appeared in the Sierra Club library, which at that time wasn't very well known, was rather marginal, but it was one of the first publishing houses that took an interest in ecology, yes, and how to, so he was a good friend of Wallace Stegner and some of the other people. He read Getty, because, I'm concentrating on his prose, but he's also a fiction writer and he's a poet. And somehow also, I think one other element that he shares with Native Americans is that in his work, sometimes the genre boundaries are not extremely clear, yes? So he could jump from something that is very much literate and written to more oral forms of communication. So I think that this kind of transgression of what we think of now as the so-called canonical genres is also something that relates him to the Native American traditions. As I said, although he places, of course, farming at the very center and agriculture at the very center of his discussions. There are many other issues that come up while he's doing that. And he's particularly interested in the kind of clashes that take place now between, as I said, progress, civilization, and what there I refer to as all forms of life, which seem to be under siege, the exploitation of natural resources, disregard to the kind of values that have guided. He's very concerned, and this is something that he refers to as, well, it is practical because he's trying to protect them, but it is also, he thinks of it as a moral issue, because he thinks that that disease I was referring to before is a kind of spiritual or moral disease, that it is the character of people now that has changed primarily, and therefore his battle becomes more urgent precisely because what needs to be changed is, of course, the kind of practices, but that will only happen if somehow our way of looking at reality, if our now relation with the world changes. So that's why I say in that in those last few lines, as is the case with the writings of many native authors, one could argue that his ultimate, and in the essays that I'm discussing here, what he's doing is trying to see how the wrongs of history and the wrongs that have been done to other races can be corrected. And he feels, as a farmer, we know that in the 19th century, farmers could be about 55, 60% of the population nowadays. If they get to the 5%, so they're a threatened minority. And with agri-industry becoming more and more, I mean, here in Spain, we've had, this was before the summer, no? There was a great debate about las explotaciones agrarias que son, no? Like, I don't know what the terms they use, no, but incredibly big and no, and where everything is automatized, and how those seem to be the ones that are in a way manageable, while small farmers are no longer able to survive, no, under the kind of demands that are made nowadays. So what I said, no, something very curious about his work is that there is a very intimate connection between his work, I mean, his writing, he thinks of, and his poetry in particular, as a form of art. But what is more curious, of course, is that he thinks of farming as another type of art, no? And the work with the land is somehow influencing people in such a way that their very worldview now is impinged now by that close contact with. So the same as Leslie Marmon, Zico, Simon Ortiz in his poetry, now the impact of the land, not only on the people themselves, but also on the kind of work that they produce is very, and he is extremely worried by what Leo Marx called the machine in the garden, now this eruption of, and how that more balanced and peaceful way of life was disrupted by this interest in profit, in production, consumption, yes? So the kind of things that we seem to be prisoners. Now there are, as you can see, now so Q11 would be, I will not have the time to go to the handout, but if you have the, I told you that this is homework. Yes. At home, you can have a look, and some of the ideas I'm referring to are very well illustrated here. Now, so for instance, if people like Louis Eldridge or Gerald Wiesner now have shown now of the kind of consequences that these attacks on the environment have had, no? Probably this is illustrated by quote number 11, this mechanically rendered infinitude of energy is an ambition surrounded by terrific problems. And we are beginning now with climate change, with the pollution and toxification of lands. We're being witness to this. Such energy cannot be used constructively without at the same time, so there is something pernicious about what he calls more industrial or mechanical forms of, he divides energy between those that are what he calls living energies, and that would be manpower, but other forms of that are more respectful to nature, and these other ones which clearly disconnect us from nature. And which way the balance will finally fall is a question that baffles the best minds. And he's somehow aware that he's a kind of crusader, because he knows that he's fighting a kind of battle that will not very easily be won, yes? So although the same as Native Americans, he's very much for continuance, for continuity, and for a more healthy relation. Not just with nature, but I think it is humans among themselves. It is those, well, as Sylvia well known, that have departed already, so it is the spiritual sphere as well. So it is different components that need to be taken into account, okay? 2 more minutes. He's very concerned with and one of the things that he underlines, and I think this is also latent in many Native American authors, that our great sin has been that we haven't set limits, that there is no kind of restraint to the way we are using nature, to the way, no? I mean, it is clear that urbanization has brought a lot of benefits, that we live better now, but one rarely sees people considering the kind of costs that this has, yes? And I think the costs are sometimes very, very, and he translates this into a kind of a spiritual crisis, yeah? So we do not only need to renew how we treat now, or to change how we treat the land, but we need that internal, that inner renewal as well before we can embark on that project. Okay, so it is all about how do we, I mean, he so often speaks about health, and where is it that we can find some healing powers, or what kind of medicines would work against this kind of race in which we are caught, yes? So that's something that the idea of interdependence between people, land, spiritual, but also the idea, and also the idea of how we often think of, and this is something very new, well, very new. It's not very new because he was writing about it a long time ago, but we tend to think of work as a kind of curse, as a kind of punishment. No, when we were to work in the morning, we're kind of, and he thinks that work should be something very, very different, that it is a kind of ritual that in fact should make you part of the whole. So the idea of wholeness, holiness, all these different concepts, health, which probably share roots of some kind, even in terms of the words we use, are very, very well integrated in. There we have him with Obama in 2011 receiving a medal. He's received a lot of awards, yes. Although he's definitely an important source of ideas, particularly for those who defend ecological causes, but he's also humble enough to say many of the kind of ideas that I am airing in my writings are not my own, yes. These I've learned by reading, and sometimes it is native authors, but what I think his readings shared is that they often come from liminal from people who have fallen on the margins of what we could think of as the mainstream culture. So his agrarian vision, yes, of course shows great respect for but also recommends what I said before, restraint. Now that, and I think that is very much present as well in the works of Native Americans. The idea of stewardship, yes, the care for the land, and how we need to be responsible. Now I don't know, Sylvia, but when you see, particularly in recent movies, now in the old movies, but much of the time you see them praying every time they feel they have disrupted some of these rather unstable balances. And so there is a kind of awareness, yes, of when you are using things, one would say in licit or illicit, legitimate or illegitimate ways. Now there is a consciousness that perhaps when he insists, he writes a lot about food and how unaware we are of where food comes from and the kind of things that are being done in order to produce particular types of, and how the food we eat makes us in a certain way. So there is a kind of no, we are becoming what we are because we're eating fast food, pizza, I guess, I don't know, these other, food that has, I had a bunch of quotations there. Some of them are brilliant, I think. The willingness to abuse other, and this is the last thing, yes, the willingness to abuse other bodies is the willingness to abuse one's own. To that, so this goes very much in line with the food thing. To damage the earth is to damage your children. To despise the ground is to despise its fruit. To despise the fruit is to despise its eaters. The wholeness of health is broken by despite. Yeah, so very, the soil is the great connector of lives. He's very much, and that would be one other primary topic that he shares, conviviality. I think the last quotation there, healing is impossible in loneliness. It is the opposite of loneliness. Conviviality, interrelating, now is critical. To be healed, we must come with all the other, not just human beings, but other creatures in creation, okay? So thank you for your patience.